My mother was a dancer and vocalist. They had something of a musical comedy act in the past. Fans of Led Zeppelin thought they were witnessing the magic of four closest friends working together for decades. However, John Paul Jones abruptly destroyed that ambition at the age of 79. He made the startling admission that the band members weren't really buddies. They didn't talk much outside of work. They didn't ever spend time together. It was just business. Jones likened it to employing random people for a position. However, that isn't even the most unexpected aspect. Your perspective on rock history will be permanently altered by the reality about what kept Zeppelin together. On January 3, 1946, John Richard Baldwin was born in the sleepy Sidcup neighborhood of London. On the surface, it seemed like a typical beginning for a boy who would eventually contribute to the development of rock music. However, the war had left Sidcup damaged in 1946. Bombing has destroyed more than 200 dwellings. Rationing continued to impede daily living, and families were forced to relocate. There were modest, two-story homes along the street where John first opened his eyes, many of which were only £800 in value at the time. The neighborhood was packed with soldiers, still troubled by the conflict, while children played in the craters caused by falling bombs. A future musical talent quietly started his journey from this odd place. He was born into a musical family, one of the most prominent dance bands in Britain. Bert Ambrose's orchestra featured Joe Baldwin, John's father, as its chief arranger and pianist. Joe's arrangements were heard by royalty and some of the most well-known singers of the era during the orchestra's performance for high society at the Mayfair Hotel. Additionally, John's mother was a trained pianist who played on BBC radio and in theaters. Their house was constructed on music, not just surrounded by it. Shelves were piled high with thousands of symphonic arrangements, and a Steinway piano in the living room was worth more than most people made in a year. John was surrounded with the instruments of greatness from the beginning. However, his parents' glitzy professions came at a terrible price. While his parents traveled for months at a period, John was sent to Christ's College, a strict Anglican boarding school near Blackheath, when he was 7 years old. Although the cost of attending school was considerable, the emotional cost was much more. John was one of only a few lads who stayed in the chilly dorms during Christmas vacations. While the majority of the boys went home, his letters revealed a lonely youngster who was resolute in his search for solace in the music rooms, where he would practice for hours on end. Despite the severe school rules, music served as his escape. He would spend up to 10 hours a day sitting at the piano or organ, channeling his loneliness into practice that improved his skills well beyond his years. He was able to perform Bach pieces that were difficult for professional musicians by the time he was 6 years old. He was doing Chopin perfectly at the age of 9. He had already assumed the roles of organist and choir master at St. Despite still being a schoolboy, he led a 40-member choir at Bartholomew's Church. He was able to support himself with the £3 he made each week from his job. Additionally, he revitalized the church service by fusing jazz harmonies he had started playing with traditional hymns. He was dubbed a boy wonder by the locals. Despite the title, the adolescent nonetheless struggled with the burden of being abandoned. When John turned 16, something changed. It hit him like lightning when he heard Phil Uperch's bass solo on You Can't Sit Down. The bass was leading the music, not just maintaining rhythm, unlike anything he had ever heard. Motivated, John hurried to Denmark Street in London and purchased his first bass guitar, a Dallas Tuxedo. The shopkeeper, who spent almost all of his church earnings, recalled how the quiet young guy would sit for hours, playing with a focus that astounded everyone who heard him. John continued to practice non-stop after that day, sometimes for as long as 12 hours every day, combining his classical training with the rhythmic freedom he had found. He began performing professionally in sessions all around London in less than 6 months. He had a big break at the age of 17, performing alongside Tony Meehan and Jet Harris, two up-and-coming artists. John contributed to their 1963 single Diamonds, which immediately rocketed to the top of the UK charts. He was already featured on a record that sold 250,000 copies in its first week of release. While the majority of youngsters were still in school, John lived two lives for the next few years. He was the unknown session musician behind the most well-known British musicians at the day, occasionally rushing from one London studio to another with no respite. He performed on as many as 6 to 8 sessions each week. Though it was far from the fame or money his music was bringing others, he made £15 a session, which was enough to keep him going. He went back to his small apartment at night, frequently too exhausted to do anything but fall asleep. He suffered from persistent back discomfort and insomnia as a result of the schedule. However, it helped him develop the speed and adaptability that would eventually become his hallmark. Even though his name hardly ever showed up in the credits, his fingerprints were all over the music of the 1960s. He played bass for the Rolling Stones and She's a Rainbow, arranged strings for Dusty Springfield's Son of a Preacher Man, and contributed to early songs by Rod Stewart and Cat Stevens. He even collaborated with Tom Jones on a number of projects, helping to create the sound of the record that made him famous. However, he was always paid a set amount and sent on his way. His contributions that are concealed. When he collaborated with Donovan on Sunshine Superman, everything changed. Someone who could make the elements flow together flawlessly was needed for the song's distinctive pop, jazz, and Indian instrumentation, and John's arrangements did just that. After the song reached the top of the American charts, producer Mickey Moe quickly signed him to hundreds of new projects. Through this relationship, John got to know fellow session musician Jimmy Page, and the two started seeing each other more frequently. John had an almost unbearable workload between 1966 and 1968. During those 3 years, he participated in about 900 sessions, sometimes 3 in a single day. He rose to prominence as one of London's most sought-after musicians. But he was more worn out than satisfied. Maureen Jones was reading Disc Weekly in her Churleywood home on August 12, 1968, when she noticed a brief item. It stated that following the Yardbirds' last performance in Luton the previous month, Jimmy Page was assembling a new band. He required a drummer and a bassist, according to the essay. John Paul Jones hesitated at first, but Maureen turned to her husband right away and urged, "You should call Jimmy about this new band." In 1967, session labor had brought him $8,000, or almost $140,000 in today's currency. He also didn't want to jeopardize such a reliable source of money. However, Maureen reminded him that bands were choosing to use their own musicians, which made session employment less secure. She even gave him the phone and phoned Page's number herself. Everything changed after that little talk the following day. Page gave Jones an equal partnership in addition to a place in the band. That was when Led Zeppelin really got started. Many fans were astonished when Jones revealed something years later. He clarified in a 1975 Rolling Stone interview that despite working with Page nearly every day for 4 years, they were never close. They never went to one another's houses, never went out for drinks, and never even had lunch together. Music was the only thing that united them. Page worked roughly 180 sessions annually between 1964 and 1968, while Jones worked about 200. Only at work did they meet, but they came to have a deep understanding of music that was almost psychic. Jones even admitted that, after working with Page for years, he was unaware of his home location until 1968. Ironically, their collaboration in the studio was strengthened by their lack of personal intimacy, without interruptions from personal life. Their only concern was perfecting the song. This strategy complied with the then unwritten regulation of the London session scene. Friends weren't hired by musicians. A recording that cost $25 per hour, a substantial amount in 1965, could be destroyed if a buddy failed during a session. Since contractors received a commission for each player they hired, they were unable to take the chance of using an untrustworthy candidate. Jones and Page were repeatedly selected because they consistently performed well, not because they were loyal. It was that reputation that persuaded Page to include Jones in his new project. John was the most reliable bass player in London. He never missed a session, never came unprepared, and never let ego interfere with the music. Page had a difficulty when the Yardbirds formally disbanded in July 1968. Canceling was out of the question because they still had touring contracts in Scandinavia. Thus, he devised a daring solution. Under the moniker the New Yardbirds, he sent Jones, a strong drummer named John Bonham, and a young vocalist named Robert Plant on the road. Although fans believed they were seeing the former band, they were actually witnessing the behind-the-scenes formation of Led Zeppelin. In order to manage the band's finances and publication, Page and manager Peter Grant promptly established a business called Super Hype Tapes. Later on, Jones acknowledged that Led Zeppelin wasn't just a bunch of mates who happened to hit it big. Page had created it with care. He claimed that although Led Zeppelin wasn't precisely constructed, Jimmy put it together. Page had specifically picked performers he knew could perform at the highest caliber. Jones contributed unparalleled technical prowess and was already well known as an arranger for songs like She's a Rainbow by the Rolling Stones. Although the idea of four young men playing together out of pure chemistry was adored by spectators, the reality was more professional. Even the band's finances were mostly under Page's control. She owned 80% of Super Hype, while Jones and Plant had no ownership stake. Their personal ties remained aloof, despite Zeppelin becoming the world's biggest band. They collaborated like co-workers in a business, but Jones stated plainly, "We weren't friends." Each concentrated on their work. The four barely knew one another when they initially practiced, but the music clicked right away. Page had chosen Plant and Bonham based on vocalist Terry Reid's advice. They had arranged songs like How Many More Times and Dazed and Confused in a matter of days. Even though we hardly knew one another, the musical connection was instantaneous, and Page later remarked, "We knew we had something special from that first rehearsal." It worked because of their backgrounds. As session players with years of expertise, Page and Jones were trained to provide precisely what was required without wasting time. Plant contributed youthful, unadulterated energy, and Bonham's strength and accuracy revolutionized rock drumming. Despite their distance from one another, their combined sound was intensely emotive. The foundation of it all was Page and Jones's professional regard for one another. Behind the scenes, Both had spent years influencing British pop and rock records. Before they were ever on stage together as Led Zeppelin, from Donovan to Joe Cocker, Jones played much more than just bass in the group. Instead of writing rock bass lines as background support, he transformed them into lead parts. Few people had ever heard the sound he produced with his flowing arpeggios on Ramble On. He crafted intricate rhythms around Bonham's drumming on the Lemon tune, giving what many consider the best blues rock bass performance ever captured on tape. His work on Kashmir gave the song a timeless quality by incorporating a Middle Eastern flair. He was a composer as well as a bassist, and his lines frequently characterized the music. Although Jones was the quiet mastermind behind many of Zeppelin's most memorable moments, fans frequently concentrated on Page's guitar prowess. He arranged horns and strings in addition to playing the mandolin and keyboards. His contributions to songs like No Quarter and The Rain Song give the band a depth that is well above that of other rock bands. He occasionally played bass pedals and keyboards simultaneously while performing live, giving the impression that four men were playing an orchestra. Because of his training, he was able to incorporate jazz and classical elements into Zeppelin's songs, giving them a unique feel. Jones stayed away from the crazy rock star lifestyle, in contrast to his bandmates. Instead of attending late-night parties, he frequently left the hotel after performances to stroll the city streets by himself, mingling with the locals. Despite the popularity that surrounded him, he treasured his family life with his wife Maureen and their daughters. He was convinced to stay with the band, but at one time he thought about quitting to become a church choir master. Although he acknowledged having his share of indulgences, he took care to stay away from the risks and controversies that other band members were enmeshed in. More than anything else, Led Zeppelin was held together by Jones's discipline. He brought the professionalism and preparation of an experienced session musician to the table. He required so much preparation that they were able to record their debut album in just 36 hours. Peter Grant, the band's manager, once declared that he never wanted to hear the term "can't" from anyone involved. Jones was the epitome of that mindset. Led Zeppelin was no longer the tight band that had swept the globe by the late 1970s. Two distinct groups had emerged inside the band. John Paul Jones and Robert Plant were disciplined workers who maintained their focus and arrived on time. John Bonham battled alcoholism, while Jimmy Page was becoming more and more dependent on heroin. Their lifestyles weren't simply diverging. Their approaches to the music itself were at odds. Offstage conflict made the environment so toxic that it frequently felt like two different bands trying to occupy the same space. And Jones subsequently acknowledged that they weren't actually friends at all. The extent of the fissures was demonstrated by the recording of their 1976 album, Presence. Plant wanted to stay at home with his family because he was still healing from a major vehicle accident. The band persisted, nevertheless. In an attempt to complete the guitar parts, Page worked almost nonstop, sometimes for as long as 20 hours at a time. There was no turning back, even though Plant subsequently acknowledged that his voice sounded strained, as though the band was frantically attempting to demonstrate that it could still produce hard rock. The record itself was bare of keyboards and nearly entirely acoustic guitar. Later, Plant described it as a cry for survival, an indication that they were barely hanging on. Their last studio album, released 2 years later, demonstrated how drastically things had changed. Plant and Jones assumed charge of the sessions, because Page and Bonham were frequently not present. For the first time, Page scarcely made an appearance on a few of the songs, which were dominated by Jones's new Yamaha synthesizer. No literary credit was given to Bonham. For a band that had traditionally relied heavily on Page's guitar, it was a startling turnaround. Some band members were unhappy by the sound, particularly those who still missed Zeppelin's unpolished, guitar-heavy sound, even if Plant and Jones believed they were sustaining the group. By that point, the team hardly ever collaborated in the same space. Jones compared the procedure to ships moving through the night. While Page and Bonham staggered into the studio late at night after heavy drinking and drug usage, Plant and he would record throughout the day. Page and Bonham frequently provided stuff that Plant and Jones had to piece together, and a large portion of the music was assembled from these disparate sessions. Zeppelin had lost the renowned cohesiveness that had made them unique. Everything fell apart on September 25, 1980. Bonham had consumed approximately 40 shots of vodka in a 12-hour period the day before. He fainted at Page's house that night and never came to. He was just 32. Although choking on his own vomit was the official cause, the extent of his alcohol consumption revealed the true extent of his addiction. John Paul Jones reacted calmly and sensibly when he discovered Bonham's body the following morning. He subsequently described it as awful, but he acted quickly to inform the others and begin handling the matter. Jones saw the incident as proof that the band couldn't go on. The surviving members decided to dissolve after a few weeks. In a succinct and professional public statement, they emphasized that Zeppelin would not be able to function without Bonham. More akin to a boardroom judgment than an impassioned appeal, the decision was made unanimously. The passing of one of the greatest rock bands in history was lamented by fans. However, there was also a feeling of relief behind the scenes. Finally, the never-ending mayhem, addictions, and internal strife had reached a breaking point. The story didn't stop there either. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant got back together in 1994 for an MTV project that soon became contentious. John Paul Jones was entirely absent from the reunion known as Unlated. It was a conscious choice that demonstrated how little allegiance was left, not an accident. Even worse, they didn't invite Jones to join them when they sang No Quarter, a song that was based on his trademark keyboard work. It served as a painful reminder that his contribution to the band had never been given the respect it deserved. The following year, Jones ascended the stage to deliver a brief but memorable statement during Zeppelin's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. "I appreciate my buddies remembering my phone number at last." Although the audience chuckled, the message was clear. Everyone knew that he was openly criticizing his bandmates for excluding him from the project. That fracture never fully recovered. The old wounds persisted even after the remaining members reunited for the 2007 Celebration Day concert years later. For fans, Led Zeppelin continued to represent the heyday of rock. The reality, however, was much less romantic among the band. Together, they had created history. Ultimately, however, their journey was as much about friendship and music as it was about commerce and ego. Following the dissolution of Led Zeppelin, John Paul Jones remained silent for almost 20 years until coming forth on his own. Zuma, a daring, entirely instrumental album that lasted just under 48 minutes, was published on September 6, 1999. Everyone was taken aback by how powerful the music sounded. The majority of the instruments were played by Jones himself. He used enormous 4, 10, and even 12-string bass guitars to produce sounds so powerful that critics claimed they hinted at the hard rock he would later produce with the Crooked Vultures. He was joined by Paul Lyrie of the Butthole Surfers, Trey Gunn from King Crimson, and drummer Pete Thomas. Critics were taken aback by songs like Zuma and Bee Fingers, which demonstrated that Jones was much more than the reserved member of Zeppelin. He demonstrated his ability to construct imposing walls of sound by himself. Jones published The Thunder Thief on June 15, 2001, 2 years later. This time, he took the mic himself, shocking the crowd once more. He sung on his solo work for the first time, and the 46-minute recording showcased his versatility. He performed on a variety of instruments, including the mandolin, piano, organ, bass, steel guitar, and even oddball instruments like the auto harp and koto. Experimental writer Peter Blegvad wrote the album's lyrics, and Robert Fripp of King Crimson played guitar solos. Jones blended folk and progressive rock, creating eerie moments like his arrangement of Down to the River to Pray. He was even commended by Rolling Stone for his eagerness to try new things. Shabuya Bop, a jazz fusion composition that demonstrated Jones's ability to manipulate any genre, took the most outrageous turn. He was no longer merely emerging from Zeppelin's shadow. He was forging his own musical trajectories. Jones shocked the rock community once more in 2009 when he teamed up with Josh Homme of Queens of the Stone Ages and Dave Grohl of the Foo Fighters. The outcome was Them Crooked Vultures, a supergroup that seemed to be the realization of a lifelong ambition. Grohl had discussed the concept back in 2005, and on August 9, 2009, the band made their debut in Chicago with a covert midnight performance. All of the songs on the 80-minute set were original. Later that year, their self-titled debut album peaked at number 12 on the Billboard 200. Along with New Fang, they won a Grammy in 2011 for Best Hard Rock Performance. Jones was demonstrating at age 63 that he was still capable of producing avant-garde rock with musicians half his age. Fans were reminded that Jones was still relevant 40 years after Zeppelin's heyday, when the band got back together in 2022 to pay tribute to Taylor Hawkins. Then Jones shocked everyone by launching into classical music with The Ghost Sonata, an opera. He started the project in 2010 alongside librettist Helen Cooper, who was influenced by August Strindberg's 1907 drama. The narrative featured a student who was lured into a shadowy Stockholm mansion that was tense and full of deception. In contrast to his earlier work, Jones stayed away from electronics entirely, stating that a full orchestra was already a massive synthesizer. A brochure published in 2017 listed concerts scheduled for the 2019-2020 season, requiring many voice roles and a full symphony orchestra. The project demonstrated that Jones could apply the same passion and creativity he brought to rock to classical music. It was a jump that few musicians in his generation ever took, much less made so convincingly. Few people in the music industry could equal Jones' legacy of collaborations outside his solo efforts. He has collaborated with a wide range of artists since Zeppelin's demise, including Brian Eno, Paul McCartney, Peter Gabriel, and Ben E. The Foo Fighters, King Hart, and even the Butthole Surfers. His collaboration with Brian Eno drove him into ambient and electronic soundscapes, while his collaboration with Laura Del's Bows and the Avant-Garde Theater Company pulled him into experimental performance art. Jones demonstrated his versatility by performing When the Levee Breaks at the United Nations Peace Through Music event in 2021 to support environmental problems. He transitioned effortlessly from rock icons to punk bands to world music events, always contributing his distinct sound. However, the most unexpected part was the words, not the music. Jones eventually revealed something that shocked followers in a 2007 interview that came to light years later. He remarked of Led Zeppelin, "We weren't friends." The band had been viewed as a close-knit fraternity for decades, but Jones disclosed that their relationship was solely professional offstage. Except for recording sessions and tours, they hardly ever saw one another. He clarified that this separation might have been the reason they remained together for so long. They avoided the conflicts that broke up so many other bands of the time by staying out of personal affairs. Jones likened the situation to his time working as a session musician, when it was strictly forbidden to schedule pals for studio work. Even in their most tumultuous years, Zeppelin was able to survive because of that distance. Jones, now 79, never ceases to amaze. For the renowned mezzo-soprano Dame Sarah Connolly, he has been working on a new classical song cycle for a number of years. Its 2025 debut has been rescheduled for January 8, 2026, at London's Wigmore Hall. Composed for a Piero ensemble consisting of cello, violin, clarinet, flute, and piano. Finding the correct lines was the most difficult aspect of the project, according to Jones, who meticulously selected poems by both American and British authors for the performance, which is the culmination of a 7-year collaboration. Dame Sarah has expressed her pleasure, describing Jones as a talented composer and reminiscing about her early love of Led Zeppelin. Another milestone in Jones's incredible journey will be reached when the piece makes its premiere with the Britten Symphony and pianist Joseph Middleton.